Hello everyone. So in this video, we're going to talk about how to containerize your web applications and connect it to databases or even other services via Docker. So firstly, Docker is a operating system level virtualization that splits major operating system functionalities into containers. So a container is essentially a self-contained unit of software in which everything that you need to run that software is included. So things like the code itself, the processes, the networking, the framework, the dependencies, the libraries, everything that you're going to need to run that specific aspect of the software is going to be contained within that container. So the result of this is that it's very lightweight. Another good thing about Docker is that it contains its own virtual network. So when we need to connect our web application with a database, for example, there is an internal virtual network that we can use. So even other services can communicate via this virtual network. So obviously the advantages of using Docker for deployment is that there's faster deployment, there's less configuration to worry about, everything can run in isolation, there's portability because you will only need to install Docker on the platforms that you need it on. So you can be running it on Windows, you can run it on Linux, it doesn't matter. As long as you have this Docker daemon connected or installed, then you're ready to go. There's easier scalability as well. So the main workflow for Docker is that we start with an image, and the image is essentially a read-only template of instructions for creating a container. And when we run an image, it turns into a running container. And essentially, this is going to be the basis for our web application, as well as our database, as well as other services that you want to include as well. So in this video, I'm only going to concentrate on the bare minimum parts of connecting the two systems using a Docker virtual network. You can extend this to many other services as well. So if you want further explanations on anything that you see in this video, please email me. I'll try to make a more explanatory video in the future. All right, so let's dive right in. All right, so we're in VS Code here, and I just want to make sure everyone has Docker installed properly. So if you haven't installed Docker, you can navigate over to docker.com and you can go to products and Docker desktop. And if you download and install this executable that's here, you will install a desktop version of Docker. So what that looks like is it gives you a nice UI, and you can basically go through and take a look at all of the, no, not all of them, but a lot of the operations that we're going to be talking about here. You can actually do them with the UI. I would, however, recommend that you learn the terminal operations of how to do a lot of these commands, just because if you go to your host, you may not have a nice UI to work with. So it's always good to kind of learn all these terminal commands. All right, so the other thing I wanted to show you very quickly is that if we go to our terminal, our PSQL, which is our database, if I go to localhost and I use the default user Postgres, we'll see that it's actually not running right now. Okay, so I actually don't have my Postgres running. So I'm going to rely mostly on the Docker images that I'm going to pull and run for my application. All right, so let's get started here. I'm just going to create a very quick server, and we'll call this index.js. And while we're here, let's do an npm init just to get our package.json. And I'm not going to enter any of these things. I'll just kind of return through everything here, and we have our package.json. I'm going to install a couple of packages that I will need. So we'll do a express and also PG. Okay, so this PG is going to be our API to talk to whatever database that we're going to connect to. Well, it's going to be a Postgres database. All right, so we'll install those things. We'll note that those dependencies are now here. We have our node modules, but in a second, I'm going to delete those just to make sure, or after I make sure that my application is running properly, I will delete those, and then I will rely on the fact that those dependencies are in my package.json for the installation. All right, so very quickly, let's create this application. I'm just going to create a express application. All right, and I'm going to make my app, and then I'm going to do a pool from PG. All right, and then let's create this pool, and let's just make this new pool. Now in here, we will typically need to specify the user. So the user is going to be Postgres, the host. Now, if we were using a local host, then we would use localhost. We would also need to specify our database. I'm going to keep everything by default right now, and I'm just going to have the password called root. I just want us to note those things right now. So our host is going to be localhost. I'm actually going to change this to DB. I'm going to change the host name to DB, and I want us to note this password root, which we're going to use in our connection. Now, obviously, this is not the best way to go. We should probably hide this in a environment variable somehow. So I'll let you kind of play around with that. I'll also have a port, which I'm going to set as 8080. So I want you to note all of these things as we go along, and the different variations that I can put into Docker. Now here, I'm just going to do something with the body, and I'm going to do the app.use, express JSON, and I'm going to do an app.use, and then okay, that looks good. All right, so this is going to allow me to be able to parse the body. Let's do an app.get, which is going to be well, for now, let's send a hello world. In a second, I would probably want to do something more elaborate with this. And then I'm going to do an app dot, let's see, app dot post maybe of a user's. Okay, so our app dot post is going to give us an async. Okay, that sounds good. And in here, I'm going to, let's take name and age, and then we'll call that database. Okay, so insert into users with the name and the age, the values 1 and 2, and then let's do the response. Okay, yeah, we can do that. Or why don't we just send success? Okay, just to keep things a little bit simple. And all right, we'll do one more, which is our app.get users. And this is just simply going to be a select all from users. Okay, so that sounds good. And I'm going to do a response.send the rows. Okay, so that looks good to me right now. Let's just make sure that this thing is working. We'll do an app.listen. And I'm going to specify the port, and I'm also going to specify as a second parameter here the local host, which is 0.0.0. Now, the reason why we're doing this is because eventually we want to connect this to Docker, and in Docker, this is no longer called localhost. So I'm just going to give it the IP 0.0.0, which is essentially the localhost. And maybe after this, I will do the console.log and then the port. Okay, so that sounds okay here. In fact, I will change this localhost to the IP that I'm giving it. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to run this very quickly just to make sure I don't have any typos. It's running on port 8080, and we can very quickly just go to here and go to Postman. Let's go to port 8080. Let's send a request and make sure we do get hello world. Okay, so at least our application is running. So now let's do something more elaborate. So here, let's say I want to when we send the initial get request to the root of the application, so let's pretend that this is a login or something like that, I'm going to have an async function that is going to await the pool.query, and then I'm going to not create the database, but I will create the table if not exists, called users. So this users, and I'm going to have a serial primary key name age. Sounds good. And let's then just do a response.send. Again, maybe we'll just send success. All right, so I'm leaving out a lot of error checking and stuff like that. So obviously you will need to put in some error checks and stuff like that. Let's just make sure that everything here matches up. So we have our name, we have our age. This is serial, so that sounds good. And here we're selecting all from the users. Okay, so now I have this application. And so far, our application will work aside from the fact that we don't have a database. Okay, so right now I don't have a database that's running locally on my environment. What I want to do is use a database container from Docker in order to connect my application. But before we do that, I want to, in the same folder here, create a Dockerfile. Okay, so this Dockerfile is going to give me all of the information on how to install my application within a container. So right now, what we have is a Node application. I want to create a container that will run specifically this Node application. So I want to copy all of the information from my application, including source code, including our package.json, and then I want to install this within the container so that I can use it for another purpose. All right, so for the Dockerfile, what we're going to do is I'm going to do from node. Now, node is going to be this container that I'm going to pull from the Docker hub. So a Docker hub is kind of like a repository, very much like Node Package Manager. It goes into the repository and it's going to just bring in the container that can run already Node on it. So I'm going to pull the latest container that fits that category, and then I'm going to set a work directory. So our work directory, let's call work directory. Let's go to /user /source/app. So this is going to go inside of that container, and it's going to go into this folder, and it's going to set this as our working folder. So right now we're going to imagine that we're in this folder right now. The next thing we do is we're going to copy the app dependencies into our working folder. So take all the package whatever.json, including this package lock.json. Now, it's not necessary that we do that, but just so that we have the same environment, I'm going to copy it into our work directory. The next thing we'll do is run npm install. Okay, so that means that within this container, within the container that we've just pulled, I'm going to run npm install. So now you can imagine that inside our container, we'll have the Node modules already in there. All right, so the next thing we'll do is copy whatever's in here. Now, I'm just going to get rid of this folder for now because I no longer need it. Okay, I'm going to take everything that we're going to need from this folder, and I'm going to copy the rest into our working directory. Okay, and then we're going to expose the port 8080. Okay, so after all, when we run this application, we will be running it on port 8080. Okay, now we can use another port if we want, but it's just that this application specifically, we've set this port. All right, so finally, we're going to give it a command, which is whatever the executable is that we want to run. So I want to run node followed by not server.js, but index.js. All right, so good. So we can imagine what we're doing here is we're first pulling this node container. We're going to set a work directory. Now, if this doesn't exist, it will actually create this folder. It will copy in package.json. It will install the package.json, which is going to give us our Node modules. Then we're going to copy whatever application we have, the rest of the source code that we have into the into our container. And then we're going to expose port 8080, and then we're going to run this command. So essentially what's going to happen here is we're going to run our application within that container. Okay, very good. So the next thing we need to do is set up our virtual network. So great, we have a container that runs our application, but the next thing we want to do, we need to set up this database on our virtual network. So I'm going to create another file here called docker-compose.yaml. All right, so these files, the Dockerfile and the docker-compose.yaml file, these are standard files that when we run docker compose a little bit later on, it will be looking for these things. So I'm just going to stop this for now, and I am going to create this docker-compose.yaml file. So again, I'm not going to go through the meaning of the things I'm going to talk about. So if you want more details on what I'm typing here, maybe I can make another video a little bit later on just to go through the details of how Docker works. So I'm going to use the version 3.9 because at the time of this recording, this is the latest version of Docker Compose. So I'm going to have some services. So I'm going to create services, and the first service I'm going to create is a server. So the server is going to refer to my application. Okay, so the application that I just built, the index.js. So I'm going to have a build. I'm going to build dot. All right, so this is going to build my application. So in essence, what it's going to do is run this Docker file. Okay, so it's going to build this application, and I'm going to now assign some ports. All right, so this is the virtual network that it's talking about. So the ports, when I do 8080, so in fact, let's do 8081 just so you can see what's happening here. So when I go to localhost 8081, this is going to map inside of my container to port 8080. Okay, now again, you can set these numbers to whatever you want, but this refers to the outside world and this refers to the container. All right, so next I'm going to define my database. Now remember DB, what I called it earlier. So you see this is the name that I'm going to call it, and I had a password called root. So for my DB, I'm going to reference an image. Okay, so my image that I'm going to reference is Postgres. So you could have other images as well, but here I'm specifically going to pull the image Postgres, which again is going to be on the Docker Hub. I'm going to specify the ports as port. Again, I'm going to show you, I'm just going to use a different port just to show you how this works. So 4444, and it's going to map into 5432. So essentially what we're creating here is a Postgres container, and we have the development machine, port 4444, mapped into port 5432 into our Postgres container. And the communication between the web application and the Postgres container is going to speak through the virtual network, which we have called DB. So one more thing, I'm just going to specify the environment variables in here. So I'm going to specify a Postgres user as Postgres, and I'm going to specify the password as root. Now, if you want more information on how to use the Postgres image for Docker, just visit the Docker Hub site and look up Postgres. It will show you all of the environment variables that you have to set for different types of installations for Postgres. All right, so I want you to note that here's our password root, and we are using the password root right here. Okay, great. So I think everything is set up to this point. I'm just going to save this, and I'm just going to make sure everything is set up here. So we have our database, we have our password. I'm going to connect to this database, right? So this database is going to connect to with a user Postgres with the database DB, and I am using Postgres. Okay, so when I go to the root of the application, it's going to automatically create this table if it doesn't exist called users, which has these parameters, and then I can go in and test some of these endpoints. And of course, this is not the best setup. You could probably have some kind of login available for these other endpoints. I'll let you play around with those. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is, since we have this docker.yaml file, we need to come into here and we're going to do docker compose up. All right, so what this command is going to do is it's going to run this recipe, basically. It's going to build my application. So from the current folder, I'm going to look for a Dockerfile, and I'm going to build this application. And then I'm going to pull the image Postgres, and then I'm going to run that image as well. So essentially, I'm going to run a virtual network that allows this application to run. All right, so let's see what it's doing. And this does take a little bit of time. So I'll just kind of walk you through this process. So notice that it is actually pulling the database, right? So right now it's pulling the Postgres image, and it is downloading everything that it needs. And I'll just give it a little bit of time to run through this. All right, so after installing the application, you can see that everything is up and running and the database system is ready to accept connections. So I'm just gonna jump over here and make sure everything works, make sure I haven't made any mistakes. I'm gonna come over here and I'm going to send this request to the root of the application. And oops, it was actually supposed to be port 8081. Okay, so if we send through port 8081, it pipes into the container and it gives me success. All right, so let's just see if we can see that table. So I'm just going to open up another terminal over here, and let's take a look at our PSQL. So I'm going to do PSQL. Here I'm going to do our localhost. Okay, and our user is going to be Postgres. Now this time I'm going to specify a port, so -p, and remember our port was 4444. So if we go to our Docker compose file, you see we have 4444 is going to pipe into our container for 5432. So this is how we're going to access that database. And I'm going to go to, I think this is all we need. So the the user password was root. So I'm going to come in here and let's take a look at our data tables, and you can see that we have our data tables users. So right now we're actually inside of that container, our Postgres container, and I'm not running Postgres locally right now. I've actually shut down the database, and I'm just going through port 4444 to access the container that's in here. All right, so let's go back to Postman and just very quickly check the other, let's check the post for 8081. Okay, and the body is, I believe we had an age in here. So we had a name and an age. So let's say we have age 42, and let's send that in. And I forgot users, so I'm going to send in port 8081/users, and then here we go. Here's our success. Send in another name, for example. Let's do something like Sarah, and we can say age 35, and we'll send that in, and again, we get a success. Okay, so if we come back and send a GET request to users, hopefully we will get the list of users back from our database. All right, so everything is working here. Notice that we are going through port 8081, which is going to go into our container, and then through the internal network, the virtual network, and then we're going to get our result back. All right, so hopefully this is helpful in setting up your server. I hope everyone can kind of see the workflow that's taking place here. So if you have any questions, or if you want me to go through another video to explain all of the different Docker commands that are there. I've left out a lot of commands, but send me a request, and maybe I can make a video talking about the internals of Docker and all of the different commands that you'll need to do some debugging and stuff like that. All right, so thanks for watching. I'll see everybody in the next video.